prominent religious leaders who saw that they had a pastoral duty to their flock felt that they were crying out in the dark of night of a secular world. We thought that they felt that their followers were moving further away from the deities that they respected, that they were less likely to go to heaven, that they had all of these terrible influences on them, and they needed something to change. The thing that needs to change is that people can be encouraged to perform supererogatory practices. We think that this fundamentally fulfills the interests of religious leaders. So, some points of setup. Firstly, on religion. We think, firstly, many religions are seeing like a significant amount of backsliding in two ways. Firstly, in the number of people who actually just identify with a religion and who practice, but also secondly, in the ways that people practice them. So whether people might identify as an Anglican but don't actually go to church, they might identify as a Muslim but they don't regularly attend Friday prayers. Secondly, we think, concomitantly with this, we think that there is an increasing perception that religions are useless and that religious practice doesn't need to be going through religious institutions especially. We think that this narrative is obviously quite concerning to religious leaders but has also resulted in lower participation. Secondly, we think that there is less funding, partly because they have less members. We think that a lot of religious institutions have less money and so they are able to do less good works. They lack the resources perhaps because they're not getting the tithes that they would normally collect or the zakat that they would normally hope to receive. Third, we think that there is a smaller number of believers who are connected by practice, because when you aren't regularly engaging in a church, maybe you have some extent of spiritual connection to God, but you are unlikely to feel like you are a part of a community of believers. At most you are connected by a shared idea, but it is unlikely that people are going out and to a far less extent going out and being connected in the world. So, what does supererogatory practices look like? We think that, like we're told, in the very extensive info slide, we think that they are generally things like going above and beyond the doctrines of the religion. We think this looks like more charitable works, like giving maybe a higher percentage than 10% of your income when you are tithing, or if you are particularly devoted, maybe it looks like becoming a monk or a nun rather than just living in the ordinary secular world. So, what do we think these religious leaders care about? We think that, let's note that these are prominent religious leaders, so they are likely to have been endowed with some level of institutional power. We think that this means that they probably care about that institution and the perpetuation of its existence. Secondly, we think that obviously they are likely to care about the religion itself, that is why they have devoted their lives to it. Thirdly, we think they care about the retention and recruitment of people within the religion, getting more followers, spreading the good word. Fourthly, we think that they care about the external perception of religion and religious people. We think that obviously this has not been very positive recently. A lot of religions are much maligned in the popular psyche, and we think religious leaders regret that. But fifthly, we think they deeply, deeply care about their followers. Like I flagged in my introduction, we think that they sense a pastoral duty. They literally see themselves as shepherds of the flock in Christianity. We think those are broadly similar in a lot of religious organizations. We think that they want for their followers to experience good things, to have a flourishing spiritual life, and to be good in the eyes of the Lord. We think the reasons that these so firstly, why are these supererogatory practices likely to be good? We think there are three reasons for this. Firstly, there are institutional incentives. We think that as an institution, you are likely to weigh the interests of groups within them. You are unlikely to promote incredibly extreme or divisive or heterodox practices, and much more likely to promote things that are good for the institution, good for the people involved, and good expressions of religious doctrine. We would note that these religious leaders, again, are likely given a lot of institutional power. They have been selected by the institution. They have been chosen as the most meritorious people to be leading the church or religious institution. We think this means they care about that incentive. Secondly, we think that the discourse around religion obviously makes people unlikely to want to promote extremism. We think religions are often already seen as extreme. This is especially true for minority religions in Western countries like Islam. We think that this is it's really unlikely that people are going to encourage bad practices, especially because there are already some pushbacks against churches or mosques, and we think people discourage the practice of religion in general. It is unlikely that religious leaders would push them to do less popular things. But thirdly, because of retention incentives. This is particularly important. If you are encouraging someone to go above and beyond in a religion, it is unlikely that you're going to push this onto the person who is the least connected to the church. You are most likely to encourage someone who is very devout to go and become a nun. You are not going to take a teenager who is struggling with their faith and maybe questioning their sexuality and tell them to do the most hardcore version of that religion, or the most over-the-top version of it. But even if you think that we might get promotion of bad practices by these religious leaders, we say two things. Firstly, we think that individuals largely have consented to this doctrine to the extent that they want to go above and beyond it. They are not going to be told that they are not going to heaven or something like that if they don't do this. It is simply an extra thing that they can add on to get closer to God and to further their spiritual practice. But secondly, we think that they can likely go to a different church. We think this can even be a good thing if you realise that the furthest extent of Catholicism don't sit with you properly. Maybe you realise that actually you identify more with Protestant church. Okay, so how supererogatory to my first substantive work, how supererogatory practices reinforce the importance of the institution. We think that this does three things. Firstly, we think it's likely to facilitate the collection. Supererogatory practices are likely to facilitate the collection of resources, like in zakat, like in tithing, and we think this allows you to do good things in the community. Secondly, we think that there is a stronger feeling for believers that institutions are good because they are engaging with your life and they are encouraging you to do things. We think that this reinforces the importance of the institution to a believer's life. That is obviously something institutional leaders care about. Thirdly, we think you are able to have the standardization of practices. We think that the comparative is that individuals can do their own thing. This makes them much more susceptible to being influenced by random people who haven't been given institutional backing, rather than on our side. We think that this is worse as a leader because you lose your relevance, but you also might perceive that people are doing things that aren't spiritual groups. We also think that these fulfilling acts are very likely to increase retention in the church. 4 reasons for this. Firstly, we think that it gives you a shared community beyond ideas because you share in some actions. Secondly, we think that it feels good to feel closer to God if that is something that you believe in. We think that is in and of itself a good that keeps you in the church. Thirdly, we think that there is a huge, when you're faced with a huge doctrinal obligation, you find this very stressful. When you're given a concrete action that you can engage in, that is much nicer for you. And fourthly, we think that these acts can be aspirational. They give you something to work towards. They give you some way of making your life better and the lives of those around you. We think there are 3 impacts of this. This leads to greater institutional power, which is very important in the context of its decline. Secondly, it leads, insofar as individuals' experiences are beneficial to themselves, we think that they're probably going to stay engaged with the church. And thirdly, we think that the standardization, again, allows for the critique of misinterpretations. This allows institutions to shut down extremists who say the way to be closer to God is by doing this very bad action towards non-believers. And it also, means that the whole institution is likely to do the same thing rather than having specific cells which can promote infighting and perhaps more extremism. But also, we think that it is very, very important in this debate that religious leaders are able to have a personal sense that they have made a positive contribution to their followers' spiritual paths. We think, like I flagged in my introduction, they see the world as secular, sinful, and probably with vices abounding. They see the decline of their membership and the decline of the practice of what are perceived as non-essential parts of the religion. This likely is very distressing to them, partly just because they probably think that some people are less close to God and that they are having less fulfilling lives. Maybe God would be upset about this. We think that that really, really deeply matters to religious leaders. And in the absence of institutional power, they can also see that their flock is more susceptible to extremism. This clearly would cause them significant distress if they see people doing things that they think bring them closer to God, but actually take them further away. For these reasons, religious leaders were always better off when their followers were encouraged to be more devoted. So proud to affirm.
It's going to be 1 second with my paper. Sorry. Am I audible? 3, 2, 1. After 1A's speech, both sides can agree we have the same metric. That is, we want to improve religious uptake to the actor and the lens of a prominent religious leader. However, under status quo, which is what negative is going to push or support, we will not tell congregations that they can do certain things to get closer to God. There is now no expectation, which is what we're pushing. However, we would still expect that, significant religious men or holy people can still be held in their glory. Okay. a lot of the actors and stuff about actors that 1A does, we agree with. So stuff about faithfulness, stuff about devotion, completely agree with. We just want to caveat and add on to that, that these prominent religious leaders genuinely, in a lot of instances, have significant organizational competence and political ability, which is to say, they likely rose to these ranks because they garnered a large area of support, even within the religious priesthood, for example. You still need people to vote for you so you can ascend to bishop, etc., etc. Secondly, we would once again prop 1A's things about priorities. You want to adhere to the holy teachings. You want to lead your flock so that you can improve religion and what that looks like. Okay, 2 questions. I'm going to integrate my rebuttal. Firstly, what are the implications for these religions and for these religious leaders? And then secondly, why at a principle level this is theologically improper. So firstly, under this implication of upon religion and upon the flock. Okay. So firstly, what do they tell us? They tell us that you get more followers for 4 reasons: because you get a better sense of community, you feel better, and you get concrete things that you can do, and it's a good thing, aspirational. We all know that the degree to which you're able to influence these people, they talk about those who practice themselves, those who listen to friends in order to become closer to God, things like that. We would argue that the metric of which these institutions are influential are probably those who attend weekly mass anyways. So the influence of that is quite minimal, and we would say those who, for example, aren't dedicated foregoers to church, or you don't dedicate and pray every single day, we would say you're unlikely to reach these people anyways. Okay, what are our responses to why you don't get more followers? 3 things. So firstly, we would say that fundamentally this is theologically improper, it is not religious, it is not what religion is about. I'm going to explain that later on. But 2 things on top of that, we would say you accentuate and you're much more likely to propagate a purity spiral. And thirdly, we would say you actually increase the threshold of access. I'm going to explain this 3rd thing very quickly, or quite in depth. So this is, once again, indirect response. How do you actually increase the threshold of access for those who want to relate to religion, those who are considering joining, and those who already practice? We would say implicitly, those in the religion, because there is now a higher expectation that is taught, which is to say, by doing these things, we're now closer to God. Implicitly, in the first instance, that is a signaling mechanism that shows that there is maybe an expectation, there is definitely an expectation to do these things in order to be closer to God. What is the result of this? First thing, you probably, in a lot of instances, dissuade people who already practice. What does this look like? We say, maybe this isn't for me, maybe I can't donate an extra 10% of my income, maybe I can't relate to these things that are expected of me, maybe I don't think this is what it means to be closer to God, this doesn't adhere with my own religious view of practicing, maybe I just can't do these things, things such as celibacy, things that you can see in the info site are significant, daily choices, implications on life. Religion already is a significant, proponent in controlling things that you can and can't do. If you follow affirmative, you need to sacrifice more freedoms. People are unlikely to do that or choose to do that. Okay, what about those who want to join? Because it's very difficult to distinguish between something that you must do as a religious partaker and something that is close to God but not morally necessary, you probably conflate these things in a lot of instances. For example, if you're a Muslim, you pray every day, you pray 5 times, but then there's more things that you can do. What's the difference? What is the delineation between those 2 things? What is the impact and the result of this? We would say 2 things. Firstly, on conservative communities, and secondly, on extremism. Firstly, on conservative communities. Purity spiral, I'm going to use that as an example. So look at the Pharisees, right? Principally, we would say Pharisees, yes, they are very, very devoted to their religion, but in a lot of instances, those who are exceptionally in touch and exceptionally dogmatic in their pursuit of religions are still not considered truly faithful because they've strayed from the path of God in these examples. We would say religious communities are likely to become competitive in very toxic ways. Look at the far right conservative fringes of even Christianity, of evangelical Christianity, things like that, where we would argue that this is likely to propagate on affirmative. We would argue that is the net harm. And also consider the margins of which affirmative is dealing with, like I flagged in the earlier part of my speech. Okay, addressing extremism, all of this is indirect response to their own material about extremism. So I'm going to use the preface or the example of martyrdom, but this accentuates and extends to all forms of extremism, all forms of religion, etc., etc. So we would say that you actually like have more disincentives and you actually make institutions worse. Why is this the case? For example, Christians in China, right? If you told them martyrdom gets you closer to God, which is like a, I guess, tenet of Catholicism, right? These people who now like see this or are taught that, you know, maybe there's an expectation to sacrifice more of your life. You're more likely to, you know, forego like social expectations, especially like using this example of China, right? We give you the example where the bishop or the pope literally made direct concessions to the Chinese government in order to get the church to like not be, I guess, ostracized against. We would say this worsens ex-religious groups because they're much more likely to be combated against like societal structures. And we would argue that in all instances, like the calculators themselves, religion is in a very delicate precipice and compromise in society. You only like hold a very small sway in terms of like the perception of people. We would say affirmative, you know, takes down like, you know, the ability of the church to influence governments, for example. Secondly, on extremism, we would say like radical interpretations of, say, like any religion, we would say is bad, and this is perpetuated under affirmative because now you are like explicitly telling these people, this is a closer, like, when to get closer to God, this is like something that is held up to esteem, etc., etc. Now quickly on the principle of why this is theologically improper. Okay, two things. Firstly, I'm going to use the info slide to piggyback, but we would say that the meaning of the act as a religious follower is a free will in consciously foregoing something and sacrificing that thing in the name of your God, in your religion, your holy text as prescribed. We would say that it is the act of the active choice of foregoing something, that freedom, that gives that religious sacrifice meaning. Which is to say, if you are like actively pushing that thing, or even subconsciously pushing that thing at prayer, at mass, at preaching situations, that removes, you know, the religious significance of that. We would say, you know, for example, Catholicism, you're not expected to commit martyrdom. Those who have committed martyrdom are held in greater prestige and light, but that's still not something that everybody should do and aspire to. And we think that is something that we stand for. Okay, what does this also do? It degrades the meaning of the choices that you have already made, because choice must be absolute in order for it to be like religiously relevant. And like the theological arguments, again, this are very, very like strong. And as actors, with like caring about these theological arguments, we shouldn't do this. Secondly, the self-interest of leaders, they want like to care about their ability to teach very quickly. This actively contradicts their, I guess, goals as an actor. For these reasons, very proud to get.
Glad someone gets that. I haven't watched that video. You have to go in. I'm told it's quite salacious.
Ellie, can you hear me?
We've got to do this, but we're going to pick the restaurant.
Becoming a priest is supererogatory. There is nothing in the Bible that says that everyone in Christianity has to be a priest in order to be a good Christian. There is nothing in the Bible that tells you that that is the only way that you can ever access a close relationship with God. What it says is that that is a way to become closer to God if you so choose. At the point where Side Aft told you that they would encourage no supererogation at all, so no one ever gets encouraged to do anything except for the bare minimum, then we thought they probably locked out a pretty active mechanism by which you get any kind of ongoing religious retention. At the point where religious leaders would like no longer encourage people who had the correct skill set in order to be a religious leader to go into the necessary training that they needed to get in order to do that in the long term. We thought that at that point, that was probably a significantly larger harm that Neg had to deal with than like some people maybe not liking specific little bits of supererogation that they were under no theological or institutional like necessity to take. What am I going to do in this speech? A couple of things. The first, a quick responsive point on the degree of influence, then talking about what we thought this encouragement looked like in the context of religion specifically, then talking about alienation and thresholds for access, then expanding some of the material on this debate about the idea of extremism. First of all, on the degree of influence, what do they tell you? They tell you that it's unlikely that these things will be influential to the extent that AF claims. They tell you that therefore they're unlikely to get the kind of buy-in that we tell you they get. A couple of responses here. First of all, we would tell you in general that a high level of devotion is quite inspiring, particularly in a context where religion is perceived as being to an extent hypocritical or useless. I would say that quite a lot of people think that it is quite inspiring and quite a nice interaction when they talk to someone who just genuinely is a really deep believer in the thing that they believe in and who believes that they should want to do good things for the world because that is what their God tells them to do. At the point where they accepted that probably most of the practices that we were talking about were things that were going to be probably quite positive, we thought that it was quite likely that that devotion was quite inspiring to most people, and we thought that therefore it was probably going to be quite influential, particularly at a point where recruitment is often community-based for a lot of these organizations, i.e. you're telling someone, hi, I believe in this thing, I go to mass on these days, are you interested in coming to church with me sometime? I think it would be really, really nice. I thought that that was probably going to be quite a useful metric by which you could pull people in. The second thing to say here was that we actively told you why this further enabled community involvement, particularly through mechanisms of getting involved in your church. Maybe you taught at a Sunday school, maybe you ran a play group, but also maybe you got involved with charity and community incentives that you hadn't previously been involved with, because now you thought that you should donate 25% instead of your normal 10%. Maybe now you thought that you should be actively involved in the betterment of your community because that was something the Bible told you should do, or your religious text told you should do, and you thought that to be supererogatory was to probably engage with those things to a greater extent than you already would have. We thought that at the point where there were more devout religious people in the community who were probably doing quite actively good things, because a lot of these practices are just quite actively good, then you probably got quite a lot of pull-in that way. So that's on the degree of influence. We thought it was likely that you got quite a lot of influence at the point where these things were beneficial. So then, what does encouragement look like? They give you a few claims here, but the only really important one is that this is coercive to some extent, and that maybe you're telling people that you have to do these things in order to be a good religious person. A couple of responses here. Number one, religious doctrine is inherently instructive. It is unclear to us on side affirmative why instructing someone in something through the mechanism of a sermon is inherently coercive. We thought that people could probably take that on. All religious doctrine is instructive. All religious doctrine is telling you that you ought to live your life in a certain way. We thought that at the point where the change was marginal to say that we think living your life in a good way is like this, we think you could live it in an even better way like this. We thought that it was unlikely that if you opted for that second option, that was a coerced choice, or at the very least, no more coercive than the side that neg tells you, which is to say there is still a good way to do your life, but the good way to do your life is the bare minimum. We thought that those things hold no greater or lesser extent of coercion at the point where they no longer gave you a relative scale. So now you were just told that there is only one good way to live your life. That's no more or less coercive than anything that we give you. So it's a marginal, if not symmetric benefit at best. But secondly, we tell you that our encouragement is incredibly unlikely to be coercive. Why was that? We give you heaps of mechs that live that get basically no response. We tell you there's a personal precedent for doctrinal disobedience, that is to say, I don't have to do everything that my priest tells me I have to do. We thought that there were outline-based guidelines of what that bare minimum was, so you absolutely have the choice to abide by the bare minimum. And thirdly then, that there were institutional constraints and incentives like institutional endowment, institutional accountability, the fact that city synods meet regularly, that's a conglomeration of all of the ministers in that specific area. We thought that it was unlikely that your doctrine was likely to stray from the bare minimum. We just thought that maybe you advocated for some supererogatory practices. On top of that, we thought by that metric it was unlikely you massively swayed from the doctrine of the bare minimum in the first place. We also thought there was mentorship and regular checking in mechanisms in most of these institutions that meant it was very, very unlikely that this kind of instruction was going to be as coercive as neg tells you it's going to be. Then we told you that there was a massive pastoral care concern for your specific, for people within your, within your religious organization, within your congregation. And we thought that that had one massive impact that goes incredibly under-responded to in this debate, was crucially that they were incredibly unlikely to do this in an alienating way. Why was that? It was because they were probably required to remain within those baseline guidelines for their religious institution. It was because they were likely to only really advocate them to the most devout people anyway. So if you were new to the religion, it was unlikely you were the person who was encouraged into a supererogatory practice. You probably weren't going to be alienated by that. But also because you were able to root out extremism, because you were able to say, here are the things that we think you should do in order to be closer to God. We don't actually think you have to go and like nail bomb a school in order to be closer to God, because we as like the mainstream Catholic Church are not going to say that you have to do that. What do we tell you even more though? That that's not all. That we actually flip this. Why is it even more, why are we likely to have even less alienating religious doctrine in general on our side? The first is because you derive an emotional benefit from either engaging in the supererogatory practice or from at the very least watching someone else engage in that supererogatory practice. We thought that like SciNet kind of had to accept that some people engage in it because current precedents of devotion and current precedents of some of this advocacy mean that some people do just engage in this. We wouldn't be having this debate if there were not already monks, if there were not already nuns, if there were not already people who went to more masses than your average Catholic, right? We thought that at that point, it was unlikely that this got the kind of like large loss that they tried to tell you it got. It was unlikely that to the point where a few more people became monks or nuns, everyone else was like, fuck that, we're not religious anymore. But we also thought that it was quite likely that people could see those people and could see what they were doing as aspirational at the point where they thought that what that was good and was helpful. When we hear absolutely no response on why these things were likely to be bad or unhelpful, apart from maybe these people would be terrorists, we would just ask you, panel, to weigh that with the fact that like you're much more likely to get extremism in like decentralized groups with disparate leadership who are no longer united by like a clear institution, but maybe by some buzzwords that that institution has left behind in the decline, which is what they have to defend on their side. When you weigh that, it's unlikely that these are extremists. When we thought you got to see more devout people doing good things in your community that you thought were beneficial, it was likely you bought into that religion more. It was likely that you, as that religious leader, was significantly more capable of like caring about the pastoral care concerns for your constituency. We thought that was a good thing, and we were incredibly proud to propose.
Hey Ellie, can you hear me?
You're gonna just watch.
Yeah.
Can I be heard?
Ellie, can you hear me?
That's cool.
Okay, cool. Please, as usual, that's my notepad.
So wait, is this Brendan with an E? It's just my is this Brendan with an E?
Yeah, it's Brendan from B-R-E-N-D-A. No E.
Oh, so that was
Yeah.
the E I was
E-N.
right.
A, no E.
It's not Brandon, it's Brendan.
It's not Brendan.
There's an O in there, right?
Huh?
There's an O in there.
There's an O in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Broad.
We discussed this after. Okay, cool. All right. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. The reason why the Catholic Church venerates martyrs is because it is so hard to become one, and definitionally, not everyone should become one, because then there'll be no more Catholics. The assumption of the religion, and indeed most of the religions in this debate, is that people are fragile and fearful, and that in that state of sin, freely choosing, not being ordered to by the Pope, not because everyone else in your community is placing social pressure on you to do it, freely choosing and coming from within, feeling called by God to do so. I'm sorry, you should be quiet. Freely choosing to martyr yourself or to take on any other supererogatory act, I'm just merely using that as an example, is to come very close to Christ on the cross or very close to the will of Allah. But there's a second, less discussed reason as to why there is this distinction between the kind of acts that holy people do and the kind of acts that non-holy people or less holy people do. And that is because that kind of closeness, that kind of purity, that kind of willingness to suffer for religion is only something the special and the elect can do. And, right, therefore, if everyone tries to, if the Pope encourages everyone to be as holy as the Pope probably is, right, that meaning of those acts degrade, and the Pope himself feels less special and less holy, which the argument we give we explain, firstly, that there is a theological, an incredibly strong theological reason why there is a distinction between supererogatory and otherwise moral acts. But secondly, we explain there is a secret, hidden, self-serving reason, which is that the Pope wants to feel that only the elect, the special, the holy such as him, who devoted his whole life to the service of God, can actually attain that state of holiness. To quote Frozone, if everyone is special, no one can be. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is provide some clarification on something the second half said, and then I will deal firstly with this theological argument and the way in which that theological argument coincides with the self-image and self-interest of this particular actor. Then I'll explain the political implications for the religion of endorsing this kind of thing. First one, clarification. Second half says Second half says, we said, we're not going to tell anyone to do supererogatory acts. No, as he said, we defend the status quo. We continue to tell people, if you feel called to God, if you are a priest, if you have that kind of vocation, but of course, encourage you to do that. I don't think we're going to claim that we would say that no one can ever achieve supererogatory acts. The point is, we will not actively preach from the pulpit for a sustained period of time as a prominent religious leader that all Catholics are expected to be celibate forever, or for example, in other religions, that everyone should really try and become a monk, etc., etc. So, what is the argument from theology? The point here is the meaning of the act. The reason why it is so close to God is because it is freely chosen, despite all of the reasons why you would not want to do the things that you were meant to do, right? That is why there are such special and sacred acts, right? And if you tell everyone to do it, and everyone is kind of it's now what we do, they no longer have that special closeness, that specialness, right? Because of that, this is the theological reason. There is a distinction between being a good Catholic and being a martyr or a saint, is because we are sure the saints got into heaven, they're part of the canon, they were canonized, and the point here, right, is that there is a strong theological argument that explains why it's the case. Because if you endorse this belief, you are admitting, right, that maybe humans aren't as sinful as theology otherwise teaches and as Christ or in other religions as they teach. So there is a contradiction in the argument in a theological sense that means you cannot preach this. And that has a very important implication in the debate. Because this actor is very likely, for reasons both teams give, to believe in theological arguments, they are unlikely to do this because they do not want to preach primal scripture or propagate serious theological contradictions. And the other argument we give here is this obviously coincides with their self-interest, because it is a self-flattering view on the part of religious leaders that says only holy men can attain the particular state of grace that is required and comes from conducting supererogatory acts. And if everyone can do it, I am thereby less holy, right? Because holiness is a measure of social status in the context of this debate and in the context of these communities, and social status is a zero-sum game, right? That is the problem with their case, which is to say, the Pope doesn't want to say, well, every Catholic should try and be like me, because only I am like me. That is why I'm venerated. That is why I have my special mission. That is why I'm here. That is specific, right? The act of a supererogatory act is something that comes from within. It's something that you're called, you feel called by Allah to become closer to Allah. You feel called by Christ to do specific actions. That is why it is the case. It is not like a policy that you can implement. It is a unique point on someone's faith journey. Okay, that is the first reason why no religious leader would ever push this. But what are the implications for the religion? We explain it is like you use this to disenchant and scare people away. Because the Pope says, well, everyone should try and be celibate. Everyone should try and everyone should actively try to become a martyr or do very, very, very Catholic things. That obviously means that for people who are on the margins, who are questioning or tussling with their faith, are going to go, this is not who I am, this is not who I can be, I don't think I can do this. They're going to feel alienated from the church and then step away. And people who are considering joining will go, this is much more extreme than I thought it would be. It's asking much more of me than I thought I could give. I don't think I'm going to be able to participate. I think I'm going to do it. And in the context where religion is in decline, this is obviously really important. They say, well, you can do it in clever ways. No. If you make a big public announcement and repeat that public announcement that you have to do very serious and extreme things, and that's an encouragement and a standard that you have to reach for, everyone's going to hear it. So everyone's going to interpret that message and understand that's what's necessary for that community. They then say, well, devotion is inspiring. It depends on what you're doing. Self-flagellation out of devotion is not an inspiring thing to see. It is incredibly disturbing. And in the context that gives you want the way that the problem is, the way in which people join churches and become converted is they go, they often have a moment where they feel broken, they feel afraid, they feel sinful, and the way in which religions work is they say, We are like that too. That's the point of our religion. That's why we accept you. This is crucial to understanding the process of the way in which people enter religious belief, is the understanding that people have this essential base commonality. And of course you contradict that when you say that everyone in the church should be as the saints are. That's not how religion works. The other material actually in the prior point was about coercion. And they bring a bunch of mechanisms in, obviously misunderstands the point. The point is not this, is that revelation cannot be a policy. So, let's now move on to the other political implications. Because they say, well, people will do it and they'll be really excited, it'll be really good. Our claim is, of course, some people will, and there are conservative communities, and what you get is a purity spiral, right? You get people trying to compete for social status by looking as holy as possible, and there are direct religious teachings which explain why that's often so harmful in religious communities. Because every act you do to try and act, it's a sin of pride. You're trying to make yourself be more holy and therefore raise your self-esteem in the eyes of your fellow believers. That, of course, distances you from God. That's what the people who do this all of the time feel like religion has failed them because they've sacrificed so much and they feel very so alone. The final thing we explain, to no response, and it is probably the most important argument of the day, is the political implications here. The most important job of a lot of these guys is managing the perception of religion from the outside world, right? And also caring for the communities that are under current persecution. If the Pope says all Christians should be willing and excited to become martyrs, the Chinese government is not going to look particularly highly on that, and you have to often conduct a delicate compromise between the governments that are persecuting members of your faith and your faith. That's why they do this. Similarly, right, if imams globally were to say all Muslims should consider trying to martyr themselves for Allah, you can imagine the reaction of certain Western governments to that kind of thing and the perceptions that how they may affect Islam. The point is, these guys are political operatives. They operate in a world where religion is often treated poorly, is often disliked, and it's often pushed back on, and religious people are often persecuted. Saying this kind of stuff emboldens these extremists within your church who feel like the Pope is finally listening, and of course, it pushes people further away. All of this is to say, it's very bad.
The way that side negative loses this debate is because by the very end, they stake their entire case in grounding impacts that they never mechanized why they were likely. They never told you why the institutional incentives of these community leaders were to encourage you to martyrdom. They never weighed that against our analysis, which told you that they probably had more reasonable incentives, like wanting you to participate, like wanting you to donate more, like wanting you to have and foster a sense of community that meant that individuals were likely to come back and that the retention levels were meant to be higher. At the end of this debate, given the fact that we give you a reasonable conception and they give you assertions that are grounded in nothing and are completely just ignorant to the current empirical reality of what the Pope is currently doing and what religious leaders currently do, we win this debate quite clearly. Two issues in this speech. Firstly, on the issue of alienation and coercive purity spirals, and then secondly on fulfillment and your capacity to influence people. Firstly, on the question of alienation, they told you that's going to be alienating because you're prescribing individuals to do things that are very taxing and they're just not going to want to do it. The first thing to say here is that note that these people have opted into the doctrine, right? And that is important for a couple of reasons. It means that firstly, they are already under some injunction or obligations to do certain things as prescribed in the Bible. But we are talking here about a marginal increase in the things you can do extra to increase your capacity to be closer to God. We think then that substantially mitigates their harms there because you already have to consider and weigh you have to do certain things. We think the things that you ask people to do in addition are likely to be positive. We think they're likely to be framed as things that, we allow now for us to alleviate abject poverty because we are increasing we are increasing the amount of donations. We think you can frame those things as positive. The second thing to say then is that it was unclear then for us to why people would have to be overly prescriptive, because we tell you throughout our case that we were likely to vary the extent of advice or vary the extent of encouragement on the basis of individuals. They knew their people well. We think they had the capacity to do that in a way that was good. But note that thirdly, we think they were also themselves cognizant of potentially alienating people for these reasons, right? They knew the fact that people didn't want to be overly taxed. We think they were going to do this in a way that was good. They never give you analysis for us to why they would definitely do this in a way that was bad. I think that at the end of this debate, you have to believe that they mediated the very reasonable incentives they have and a very reasonable understanding of the interests people have, and then did it in a way that was probably reasonable and good. But note that at the end of that, they just were never really comparative with the actual case that we give you.
Because we tell you that it isn't just the case like you only have institutions prescribing things and then no one tells you anything. We told you there was also a third case in which now it was decentralized actors that were telling you and interpreting this Bible and interpreting this doctrine. Why was that bad? It meant that firstly, in the case you just had your family member now the only individual who was telling you like these are the additive practices you can do to get closer to God, it was likely to be worse. It was likely to be less centralized and standardized because you didn't have, because like you're like one patriarch in that family, didn't have to weigh huge institutional incentives of I want to keep a congregation together, I don't want to alienate individuals, they just want control over you. I think that if you can have the mitigating force of a institution that you come to and say, oh, actually these are the practices and they are not what he is telling you, that is a positive thing for that household, we think we win on that point. The next thing to say then is about the thing of like choice, right? They really try to state their entire case at the last speech on like choice being like equaling fulfillment. We think like in regards to this and alienation, like, okay, the question like, does fulfillment and choice make people like less alienated, or do our mechanisms actually work? We think the first thing to say here is that encouraging individuals to do certain practices does not preclude them from having free choice. It was very unclear and under-mechanized for us to why that was the case. We're going to give you reasons for us to why it was actually untrue. The first thing to say is because they had to be comparative to the ways in which present doctrine was instructed. We told you this at Rose, it doesn't get responded to. But secondly, note the fact that we have like narratives of like inherent fallibility in religious doctrine that say you are imperfect and you are striving towards something. We think those mitigate the kind of things they tell you in which we think those mitigate the types of things they tell you in which you just feel like bad about never achieving these standards, because you have those like doctrines that tell you you are fallible, you are always striving for something, it is aspirational, do not judge yourself today as though it is judgment day, because today is not judgment day. We think that thirdly though, you always have a certain degree, there always exists a certain degree to which like people are telling you to do something. That like is kind of linked to the analysis I bring you before when I tell you that there are always going to be people who tell you things. It is simply just worse when they are decentralized actors, right? We think then they have to be comparative. Was it the case that you also precluded choice when it was your patriarch or your husband telling you these are the religious practices? Was it also the case like that you precluded choice when it was just some random actor on the internet or in your community telling you that these are the religious practices? They never tell you why no one else was likely to speak. They only tell you that these religious leaders should not speak. The next thing to say then on the question of like alienation. So we think that what are the actual drivers of alienation and why do those fit with our case and make us win clearly? We told you that first of all, there was the fact that institutions of religion are now being perceived as obsolete. We gave you those structural reasons for us why now there are narratives towards like individual spirituality and like do it at home. They were making the church and institutions not be able to facilitate things, not be able to, secondly and very importantly, raise funding. They really do not engage with this point sufficiently to mitigate it, because firstly we told you that was inherently linked to ability to do things like provide food, to alleviate poverty. That was very good for your perception. It was very good for the capacity to like encourage people to come back, to encourage people to feel a sense of community. We think that for all of those reasons, we're likely to mitigate alienation under our side of the house. They never proved to first why they have the worst case of things they are telling people to do, like martyrdom, that will make people turn away. We are the side that proves to us why you get good things that make people come towards you. At the end of that, I think you just believe that we were the side that mitigated alienation because of the structural factors we gave you as to how alienation is currently occurring. The next thing to say though, about the capacity to influence and like the choice and fulfillment. So firstly, they tell you that your capacity to, and this comes early, but I think it's still important to respond to, they tell you your capacity to impact individuals was like contingent on how much they were already devout to the church. But we can now flip this analysis and actually use it to like further our margin, because firstly, it was very concessionary to say that like the extent to which someone participated in the church was like congruent to how devout they were. We think that if we could prove that participation increased devotion, that was a good thing for the institutional leader who wanted people to be devout. What were the actual reasons for devotion? Firstly, we tell you it is not true that people are just born with a fixed amount of religiosity that never changes throughout life. We tell you it is far more predicated upon a sense of community, about sharing practices with other individuals beyond just nebulous ideas of what it says in the doctrine. You can say, oh, how are your surahs? You can relate to people and come to a table when you can actually fund that through like deriving money. We think that those things are how you connect with people in a sense of community. That makes you feel the religion beyond just like a text. That makes you personally like feel committed to it. We think that for those reasons, people are likely to increase their participation and therefore increase their devotion because it's something that is real and not just in your head. So for that reason, we actually just weaponize their attack against us and tell you first why we increase participation and therefore devotion. Lastly, on the question of fulfillment in this debate. So we tell you quite clearly that at first, that the doctrine in some circumstances is simply so overwhelming, and the obligation of like, you are going to heaven or hell, and like these huge like lofty and abstract sentences can actually be in some circumstances more stressful than simply just having a clear list of instructions, and this is how you can actually approach that. This is how you can actually further your spirituality beyond just like this very lofty and unclear idea that is in that doctrine. But I think that to the extent that these institutional leaders can kind of simplify that for you into actions that are concrete and actionable, that makes it easier for you because you don't have to internalize that process yourself. You don't have to be the one who always is figuring out how do I actually achieve this like commandment to be like a very, I don't know, like a commandment to be this type of person. They tell you that. That is instructive, and I think that is good for you if you likely have that pressure. And yeah, the last thing just to remember in this debate was that they never actually ground the impacts in analysis. We were the side which told you the reasonable incentives they had and the way they were likely to act, and we told you why that increased participation and diversions. For all those reasons, we won this debate.
Just checking if I'm audible.
Yeah.
Awesome. Why side affirmative loses this debate is because they refuse to engage with us that while religion is important, and while religious leaders are important in guiding their flock, they also have a massive responsibility to maintain their public image and to make sure that the flock that they're taking care of isn't persecuted or isn't seen in this extremist manner that they will be if these kind of these extra acts are going to be perceived as, right? We think that Brendan very eloquently told you how about how this political image is something that has come upon religious leaders now, and we'll show you exactly why that was one of the biggest impacts that helped us win this debate, right? But in order to do that, I'm just gonna put this debate into context under four main points. So what did side affirmative tell us, right? On the first level, they told us that, you know what, that the problem that they contextualized and they clearly told us was that religious leaders feel like their flock is moving away, and that, you know, this is something that they want to protect. They told us, you know, that people, even though they identify with a religion, they don't engage with the practices, and that this is a problem, right? So upon analysis, and after our two speeches, what we can conclude is that by adding these extra responsibilities, by setting these extra expectations, we say that by their own analysis, you see people moving away from the church, right? Because in the status quo, if easy things like just going to church, just reading the Bible once in a while, just like doing the 5 daily prayers, if that already is something that is pushing people away, what is it that brings people to the church by adding these extra kind of duties, these extra checkboxes that needed to be ticked, right? Because we don't see under the very characterization at the beginning of this debate, right? But what happens as the debate goes along? They tell us, you know what, you find this community in Acts. You find this community in Acts, you know, by priests actually existing, it shows that people get a benefit from this, right? We have a lot of ways to respond to this. The first one is how we told you and is how we defined and characterized these supererogatory acts, right? Because we told you that we agree that these acts are important. They are important. There is prestige in doing this. But what happens when you start encouraging everyone to do this? We think that in their world, if that does happen, we don't think it will. But we say that if it does happen, what happens is it takes away this prestige. It takes away this importance. And we think that this importance is something that's important in religion because it shows you what a saint looks like. It shows you what a religious leader looks like. And we agreed with them. Having this distinction, having these religious leaders are extremely important in religion because these are the mouths of God. They come straight from from God. They are the people who lead you. They are the people who counsel you and guide you. We think that that's why it exists, and only since a select few of people can necessarily achieve these goals, we think that that's why it's important that it's not something that everyone has to aspire to, because it's very difficult. The kind of things that need to be done to achieve this, it's very difficult. Things like celibacy, things like not getting married, things like sacrificing your social life and like social practices to pray a lot during one day. These are very difficult things, and we think this prestige has to be attached to these acts for a reason, as I told you before, right? But what was the response to this? They told you, religious leaders are not going to push these extremely hard acts, things like martyrdom. They're not going to push these acts because it won't cause retention, things like that. What was our response, right? Brendan told you in his speech that the problem is by pushing things that even look mildly extremist, the problem is that governments interpret it as something really bad. Because that's just how, unfortunately, in the status quo, that's how religions and ideologies are looked upon. They're extremely sensitive topics, especially in the status quo, in the wake of terrorism attacks, in the wake of people using religion as a tool for extremism. We think that the moment these leaders who are looked upon as these pinnacles, the moment that they are propagating and saying, you need to do these extra things that are viewed as extra, that are viewed as something that could be extremist. We think that that's the problem. It looks like you're pushing for things like martyrdom in the name of religion. It looks like you're going to do things that are harmful to society, and that's the problem that we've been telling you from the start. It's that people are going to be persecuted for this. Religion is going to lose a lot more by pushing for things that are extra, for pushing for things that look scary. And we think that this is the biggest problem, right? And what else did they tell us? Sorry, they told us, look at by having this, decentralized kind of model where your patriarch will tell you what these extra acts are and things like that. That's how extremism occurs, right? We think that no. We think that when religious leaders talk about this stuff, we think that that's what happens then is that it sets an expectation. It sets a goal. It sets an aspiration. The more you do, the more holier you are, the purer you are, right? That leads to two kinds of harms. The first one is that people. This is what kind of primes people to be more extremist, because they're showing you that the purer you are, the holier acts you do, the better you are. And the second thing is, which we told you in our first two speeches, it leads to this purity spiral, where different sects, different kind of institutions, different like churches, religious groups, whatever, they all have this kind of competition that they want who's more. That kind of deals with like who's more pure, right? On another issue, what did they tell us? You get more funds in the church, there's more money to do good things, that's a good thing. And that's what religious leaders want, right? We see that religious leaders are not all about money, right? They're all about they're about being pure, they're about doing things. It's not about things like money, right? But also, what did we tell you? Under our side of the house, and what we think is very probable is that you're going to start losing people because they don't want to come to church anymore. And then what happens? You're losing out on donations. The money that you want to do good things with is not there anymore. And we also see on the third level churches and religious institutions are pretty rich and they don't need the money. And this is not how to get it if they do, right? This is not what they're going to do, right? And on a last level, right? What did they tell us? They told us that that by having this also adds this kind of like standardization. This kind of adds on to my previous point. By having a standardization, people are telling you what to do, right? We see that the context of this debate in itself shows us that there's this like moral discourse that goes into setting the standards of what a supererogatory act is, right? So we don't see what the standardization is. We think that the moment different kind of leaders are telling you what is morally right, the standardization that they are talking about doesn't really occur, because we think that morality is normative in nature. It's not something that's set out in the Bible. That's the massive problem with telling you and with setting expectations, because they themselves tell us that a priest can look at their congregation and set an expectation accordingly in order to retain the church. That's a massive problem because it's not uniform. It's the religious leaders' kind of moral assertion. It has nothing to do with the Bible. It's very problematic. We think that this kind of creates divides in the church, and that's not what we want. At the end of the day as religious leaders, we want to maintain prestige, we want to widen our flock, we want more people in the religion, and that's why we urge you to negate it.